A couple of years ago, my girlfriend Sarah and I decided to go on a camping trip, something we hadn't done together in a long time. We both love the outdoors, so we figured a weekend getaway deep in the wilderness would be perfect. Sarah and I live in Seattle, and we wanted to find a spot that was far enough from the city to feel truly isolated, but not too far that it would be impossible to drive there in a day. After some research, we settled on a campsite in the Olympic National Forest, west of the Puget Sound. It's a massive area, stretching miles of forest, rivers, and mountains, perfect for the kind of trip we had in mind. We both work busy jobs, so the idea of disconnecting, even for a weekend, sounded great. We left early Friday morning, packed with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bags, enough food for the weekend, and some extras in case we got hungry. We also brought a portable gas stove and a cooler to keep things fresh since we didn't want to rely too much on campfires. There's a thrill in knowing that once you're out there, you're on your own. No cell service, no distractions, just you and nature. That's exactly what we wanted. The drive took a little over 3 hours. Once we crossed the Hood Canal Bridge, the landscape quickly became more remote. Forests thickened, and the roads narrowed. By the time we reached the small town of Hoodsport, we were almost at our destination. It's the last bit of civilization before you head into the deeper parts of the forest, and we stopped at a local store to grab some last-minute supplies, snacks, an extra flashlight, and more water. The locals were friendly but didn't have much to say when we told them where we were headed. Just a quick nod or a "be careful" before we went on our way. We arrived at the trailhead around midday, parked the car, and started hiking toward our planned campsite. The trail wasn't heavily trafficked. It wasn't one of the main tourist spots, which is exactly what we were looking for. We hiked for about 2 hours before we found the perfect spot. A small clearing next to a stream, surrounded by towering trees. It felt secluded, peaceful, and just far enough off the trail that we wouldn't expect to see anyone else passing by. We set up camp quickly, pitched the tent, gathered some wood for a fire later, and made a quick meal. The first evening was uneventful, relaxing even. The sound of the stream flowing beside us was calming, and the woods around us were eerily quiet, but it felt normal. After dinner, we stayed up for a bit, chatting and stargazing before eventually calling it a night. It's always a little strange the first night in the wilderness. Every little noise outside the tent feels amplified, but you remind yourself it's just wildlife. I remember hearing some rustling that night, but I wasn't concerned. We were in the middle of the woods after all. There's bound to be animals moving around. The next day was more of the same. We spent the morning hiking further into the woods, exploring, and just enjoying being disconnected from everything. We didn't encounter anyone else the entire time, which was a little surprising but not unwelcome. By late afternoon, we made our way back to the campsite. That's when we noticed something odd. Our food supplies, which we had left tied up in a tree to keep away from animals, were scattered across the ground. The rope had been cut, not chewed or torn, but cut cleanly. I thought it was strange, but we assumed some animal had gotten clever, or maybe there was a sharp branch that sliced it. Still, it felt off. That night, things got weirder. After another campfire dinner, we went to bed early. I fell asleep pretty quickly but woke up around midnight to the sound of something moving around outside the tent. I stayed quiet, trying to listen closely, and heard footsteps. Not the light, random movements of an animal, but deliberate, slow steps. I thought maybe it was just deer or something, but then I heard what sounded like faint whispering. It wasn't clear enough to make out any words, just soft, hushed voices that didn't make sense for where we were. I nudged Sarah, who had already woken up by this point, and we both sat there in silence listening. The footsteps circled the tent a few times, stopping every now and then, as if whoever or whatever it was knew we were inside. We didn't dare make a sound. I was wide awake, heart pounding in my chest, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps eventually faded away into the woods, but we didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every few minutes, I would hear something, a twig snapping, leaves crunching, and I was convinced someone was out there watching us. By morning, we cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Nothing looked out of place, but then I saw them. Muddy boot prints leading right up to the tent's entrance. They stopped right there, as if whoever it was had just stood there watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine. These weren't animal tracks. Someone had been out there, walking around our campsite. But there were no other signs of anyone. No broken branches, no disturbed ground, nothing. The rest of that day, we were on edge. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some harmless passerby, maybe a hunter or hiker who had wandered too close. But it didn't feel right. The fact that they left no other traces and had come so close to our tent without making their presence known was unsettling. We spent that day mostly hanging around the campsite, too nervous to wander far from our things. It felt like we were being watched, but every time I scanned the trees or the surrounding area, there was no one. We discussed leaving early, but we had only planned for one more night, and part of me didn't want to let some creep ruin the whole trip. I figured if we stayed close to the camp and stayed alert, we'd be fine. That night, though, things escalated. Around the same time as the night before, just as we were settling into the tent, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be subtle anymore. I could hear them crunching the leaves and twigs, walking in slow, deliberate circles around the campsite. My heart was pounding in my chest again, and Sarah grabbed my arm tightly, both of us lying perfectly still. Then, the whispers started again. This time, they were clearer, closer. It sounded like two people, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. The voices were low and indistinct, almost like they were speaking in code. I started to wonder if maybe we weren't as alone in these woods as we thought. Maybe there was some hidden trail or another campsite nearby, but it didn't make sense. The footsteps were too close, the voices too quiet, as if they were deliberately trying to keep us from hearing them clearly. We lay there for what felt like hours, listening to these unknown people walking around our campsite, whispering to each other, and occasionally stopping right outside the tent. At one point, the footsteps stopped altogether, and I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I heard the sound of something being placed right outside the tent. A dull thud, like something heavy being dropped. But I didn't dare move. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the footsteps and whispers faded again into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Neither did Sarah. We just lay there, listening for any sign that they were coming back. At first light, we packed up as fast as we could. I unzipped the tent cautiously, looking outside to make sure no one was around. The boot prints were back, clearer this time, leading right up to the tent and then stopping. And right outside the entrance was a pair of muddy boots, old and worn, just sitting there as if someone had left them for us. That was it. We didn't stick around to see if anyone would come back for them. We packed up everything as fast as we could, barely speaking to each other, and hiked back to the car. The entire way, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us, but there was no one. We made it back to the trailhead without incident, loaded up the car, and drove straight back to Seattle, barely stopping for anything. To this day, I don't know who was out there with us or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some sick prank, or maybe there were people living out there who didn't want us around. But the way they moved, the whispers, and the fact that they left those boots behind still sends chills down my spine. We haven't been camping since. A few years ago, my friends and I went on what we thought would be a fun camping and hiking trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains, not far from Asheville, North Carolina. We were 4 friends, me, Luke, Kevin, and Jake, all in our mid-20s at the time. We had been talking for months about getting out of the city and into the wilderness for a long weekend, and this was finally our chance. I grew up hiking and camping with my family, so I wasn't a stranger to spending time in the woods, but I had no idea that this trip would stick with me the way it has. We left on a Friday morning, excited and packed with everything we'd need for a few nights out in the mountains: tents, sleeping bags, food, and plenty of water. The Blue Ridge is a popular spot, and we had planned to hike a trail that was fairly remote but nothing too extreme. Our plan was simple: hike in for a day, set up camp, and spend the next 2 days exploring the surrounding area before hiking back out on Monday. We drove out from Asheville, and the farther we got from town, the more beautiful and isolated the scenery became. It was late spring, so the trees were lush and the weather was perfect. Not too hot during the day and cool at night. After driving for a few hours, we reached the trailhead. The parking lot was pretty empty, which we thought was a good sign. We wanted to avoid crowds and have the experience all to ourselves. After a quick check to make sure we had everything, we strapped on our packs and set off down the trail. The first few hours were great. We hiked along a well-marked path that took us deeper into the forest, crossing streams and climbing small ridges that gave us breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains. It felt like we were miles away from civilization, which was exactly what we were going for. The trail was challenging but not overwhelming, and we made good time. At one point, though, we must have missed a turn. The trail became less distinct, and after checking our map, we realized we had wandered off the marked path. None of us were too worried. We still had plenty of daylight left, and we figured we could backtrack or find another trail to get us where we needed to go. After a short discussion, we decided to keep moving forward, thinking we'd eventually find our way back to the main trail. That's when we stumbled upon the campsite. It was odd because there was no official camping area on the map, and it didn't look like a designated spot at all. It was just a clearing in the woods with 2 old beaten-up tents set up. The tents looked like they hadn't been touched in a long time. They were faded and sagging with patches of mold on the fabric, and there were random bits of gear scattered around. An old water bottle, a couple of rusted tin cans, and some clothes that looked like they had been there for months, if not longer. There was a campfire ring in the center, but it was cold and covered in ash. It felt like whoever had been here had left in a hurry or just abandoned the place. I remember Jake making a joke about how it looked like something out of a horror movie, and we all laughed it off. We figured it was just an old campsite someone had left behind after they moved on. But there was something about the place that felt wrong. It wasn't like seeing an abandoned campsite on the side of a busy trail. This was way off the beaten path, and the longer we stood there, the more uncomfortable we all felt. We didn't want to waste daylight, so after a few minutes of poking around the site, we decided to stay there for the night. It wasn't ideal, but we didn't want to risk getting lost in the dark, and the clearing was flat enough for our tents. Besides, it seemed like a good spot. It had a fire pit, and we figured we could make the most of it. We set up camp and got a fire going as the sun started to set. The atmosphere felt different from earlier in the day. It was quiet. Too quiet. There were no sounds of birds or insects, just the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. We tried to ignore it, though, and spent the evening talking, cooking dinner over the fire, and planning our hike for the next day. By the time the fire burned low, we were all feeling tired and ready to get some sleep. That's when things got weird. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of movement outside my tent. At first, I thought it was one of the guys getting up to go to the bathroom or something, but when I listened closer, it didn't sound right. The footsteps were heavy and slow, not like the quick, casual steps of one of my friends. They were deliberate, almost like someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't doing a good job of it. I lay there, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something. But then I heard something else, a low, muffled sound, like a mix of distant laughter and crying. It was faint, but it was there, just outside the tent. My heart started racing and I strained my ears, trying to figure out what it was, but I couldn't make it out. I was wide awake at this point, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Then, the footsteps stopped. I stayed still, waiting for something to happen. But everything went silent again. After a few minutes, I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent a little and peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows around the campsite, but I didn't see anything. No movement, no people, nothing. Just the empty clearing and the other tents. I was too freaked out to fall back asleep, but I didn't want to wake up the others and cause a scene. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening for any more sounds. Eventually, exhaustion must have taken over because I drifted off again. The next morning, I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to seem paranoid, and for all I knew, I had just imagined the whole thing. We packed up our gear and started hiking again, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was off. The trail we thought would lead us back to the main path never materialized. Instead, we kept moving deeper into the woods, further from where we thought we should be. By midday, we were all getting frustrated. The map wasn't helping, and none of us had phone service. We decided to take a break and figure out our next move. As we sat there trying to decide whether to turn back or push forward, I noticed something in the distance through the trees, a faint, almost imperceptible shape. It looked like another campsite hidden behind a small hill. I pointed it out and we decided to check it out, hoping it might give us some clue as to where we were. As we approached, I felt that same sense of unease from the day before. The closer we got, the clearer it became. It wasn't just a campsite. It was another old, abandoned site, just like the one we had stayed at the night before. The same sagging tents, the same scattered belongings, the same cold fire pit. It was like we had walked in a circle and ended up back at the same place, even though we had been hiking in a straight line for hours. We all stood there in silence, trying to process what we were seeing. Kevin spoke up, saying that we should just leave, head back to the car and forget about the rest of the hike. I think we were all ready to agree, but we didn't want to admit we were spooked. We continued hiking, trying to find our way back. By late afternoon, we realized we were lost, and we still hadn't seen another soul the entire time we'd been out there. It was unsettling, knowing how popular the Blue Ridge area was, yet we hadn't run into a single person on the trail or seen any signs of other hikers. It felt like we were the only ones out there. As the sun started to set, we knew we had no choice but to set up camp again. None of us wanted to sleep at another abandoned site, so we found a new clearing a little ways off the path. It wasn't ideal, but we didn't have much choice. We set up our tents, ate a quick dinner, and tried to get some sleep. That night, I woke up again to the sound of footsteps, but this time they were closer, louder. I could hear the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs as someone, or something, moved around the campsite. My heart raced, and I lay there completely still, listening. Then I heard something even more terrifying, the sound of a zipper being pulled open. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. One of the tents was being opened slowly, quietly. My mind raced. Was it one of my friends? Had one of them gotten up to check outside? But then, I heard a gasp, followed by hurried footsteps. The zipper noise stopped. I didn't move. I didn't want to make a sound. I could hear whoever, or whatever, had opened the tent still moving around outside, walking slowly. My mind was going 1,000,000 miles an hour. Was it a person? An animal? What the hell was going on? I lay there, sweating, trying not to make a sound, and eventually everything went quiet again. I don't know how long I lay there, but it felt like hours before I finally fell asleep out of pure exhaustion. The next morning, when the sun came up, I stumbled out of my tent, bleary-eyed and shaken. I found the others already outside, pale and quiet. Jake, who had been in the tent next to mine, looked like he hadn't slept at all. He said he heard someone or something outside his tent, unzipping it. But when he looked out, there was no one there. We didn't talk much after that. We packed up in silence and started hiking again, desperate to find the trail and get back to the car. It took us all day, but eventually we made it back. I've never really talked about this before, but after stumbling across a few similar stories online, I thought I'd share what happened to me a few years ago. I've camped solo a lot over the years, and I've had my fair share of creepy moments, but nothing quite like this. It was the summer of 2017, and I decided to take a solo camping trip to Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I live in Pittsburgh, so it's a few hours' drive, but I'd been there a couple of times before. It's a beautiful spot if you want to get away from everything. Dense trees, long trails, and plenty of areas where you can be alone if that's what you're after. I had some time off work and figured it would be the perfect opportunity to disconnect for a bit. Just me, my gear, and the woods. I'm not really big into social media or anything like that, so this kind of isolation has always been appealing to me. I planned to spend 3 nights camping, hiking, and fishing away from everyone. I packed up my truck with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a cooler with some food, fishing gear, and the usual stuff like water, a small stove, a lantern, and my campfire tools. I had a basic campsite in mind that I'd been to before, right by one of the smaller creeks that runs through the forest. It's not on any of the main trails, so it's pretty isolated. I wasn't expecting to run into anyone. On the drive up, I took my time enjoying the scenery, listening to music, and just relaxing. Once I was deep enough into the forest, I turned off the main road and onto a narrower dirt path. It's one of those roads where you'd better hope no one's coming from the other direction because there's barely enough room for one vehicle. The trees hug the road so tightly that sunlight barely makes it through, casting long shadows everywhere. I passed a few cars here and there, mostly near the entrances of more popular trails. Nothing unusual, just other people enjoying the forest. A little further down, maybe half an hour from my destination, I spotted someone walking on the side of the road. He looked rough, dirty clothes, scruffy beard, carrying a ratty-looking backpack. Not the kind of person you'd expect to see out here. He raised his hand as if to flag me down. I slowed the truck, rolling down my window a bit to hear him, but I didn't stop completely. My gut told me something was off about him. He asked if I could give him a ride into town, said he'd gotten stranded while hiking. Normally, I'm not the kind of guy to leave someone out in the middle of nowhere, but there was something in his eyes that put me on edge. I told him I was going the opposite direction, towards a more remote area, and kept driving. He didn't try to stop me, just stared as I drove off. I checked my rearview mirror and he was still standing there, watching my truck until I turned a corner and lost sight of him. It didn't feel right, but I brushed it off. I figured he was probably just another hiker who had a rough time out there and needed a hand. I arrived at my campsite a bit later than planned. The sun was starting to dip below the trees, and I had to hurry to set everything up before it got dark. I pitched my tent close to the creek, got a fire going, and sat down to relax for the evening. The sound of the water and the wind through the trees was calming, and soon enough, I forgot about the weird guy on the road. I spent most of that first night sitting by the fire, eating a quick meal I'd cooked up on my little camp stove, and staring up at the stars. By the time I crawled into my tent, I was feeling pretty good. Just a normal camping trip, nothing special. The next day went as planned. I spent the morning hiking one of the nearby trails, taking in the fresh air and beautiful scenery. I didn't see anyone else the whole time I was out there, which was exactly what I wanted. In the afternoon, I did a bit of fishing at the creek. It was peaceful, and I was completely alone. That night, I built another fire, cooked up some of the fish I'd caught, and settled in for another quiet evening. As it got darker, I started feeling a bit more on edge. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, but every little sound in the forest seemed amplified. I could hear animals moving through the brush, birds calling to each other, and the occasional splash of water from the creek. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my nerves, and that I'd done this kind of trip dozens of times before without any issues. Still, the feeling lingered. At around 1 or 2 a.m., I was woken up by a noise. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was heavier, like footsteps, and it sounded close to my campsite. I sat up in my tent, listening carefully. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet but not doing a great job of it. My heart started racing as I strained to hear more. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to just a few glowing embers, and beyond that, everything was pitch black. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but I couldn't see anything unusual. No sign of anyone. I stayed up for a while, listening, but the footsteps had stopped. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was probably just a deer or something, and I laid back down, though I didn't really sleep much for the rest of the night. The next morning I was tired but ready to shake it off and move on. I made some coffee over the fire, packed up a few things, and headed out for another day of hiking. It was uneventful, thankfully. I spent a few hours on the trails, and by the time I got back to camp, the weirdness from the night before felt like a distant memory. That evening, I was sitting by the fire again, enjoying the quiet. It was my last night out there, and I planned to leave early the next morning. As it got darker, I kept thinking about the guy I'd seen on the road. I hadn't thought much about him since, but now, for some reason, he popped back into my mind. There was something about the way he looked at me when I drove off that hadn't sat right with me. I tried to shake the thought, but it was like an itch I couldn't scratch. I kept glancing out into the trees, feeling jumpy. I convinced myself that it was just because I was alone and my imagination was playing tricks on me. At some point, I must have dozed off in my chair because I woke up with a start, the fire down to just a few glowing coals. The night was completely silent, no wind, no rustling of leaves, nothing. That's when I heard it again, breathing. Slow, heavy breathing coming from just outside the campfire's glow. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping it across the area. And there, just at the edge of the light, was the same man I'd seen on the road standing there watching me. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring, his face barely visible in the dim light. I froze, not knowing what to do. My mind was racing, and I felt paralyzed by fear. Then slowly he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. My first instinct was to pack up and leave right then and there, but I didn't want to go stumbling through the forest in the middle of the night. I wasn't even sure where he had gone or if he was still out there watching. Instead, I grabbed my hatchet and kept it by my side, sitting by the fire until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up my gear as fast as I could, threw everything into the truck, and got the hell out of there. The whole drive back, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. When I got home, I told a couple of close friends about what had happened, but I never reported it or anything. I figured it would sound crazy, and it's not like the guy actually did anything. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling of how wrong that whole situation felt. A couple of years ago, me and 5 of my closest friends decided to go on a camping trip. Nothing unusual about it, just a group of us looking to spend a long weekend outdoors, away from work, phones, and all that. We'd been talking about doing something like this for a while, and with all of us being spread out between different cities, Columbus, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, it was a rare chance to hang out together, drink some beers, maybe do a bit of hiking, and just catch up. We settled on Wayne National Forest in southern Ohio, near Athens. It's a good spot. Lots of space, and not too crowded if you go deep enough into the trails. We drove down there in 2 cars, packed full of tents, coolers, firewood, and everything else we thought we'd need. We parked near the entrance to a less-used trail and hiked for about an hour to get to this clearing I'd found on a previous trip. It was far enough away that we wouldn't run into other people, but still accessible in case we needed to hike back to the car for anything. The first day was awesome. We got to the site in the afternoon, set up camp, and just chilled out for the rest of the evening. We had a fire going, cooked some food, drank more than a few beers, and joked around like we hadn't seen each other in years, which honestly we hadn't. The area was perfect. Totally quiet except for the sounds of the forest around us. We could see the stars clearly once the sun went down, and it felt like one of those moments where everything lined up perfectly. That night, we all crashed pretty late. Some of the guys stayed up a bit longer, but I was tired from the drive and the hike, so I went to bed in my tent around midnight. The others trickled in not long after, and soon enough everyone was out. The weirdness started the next day. We woke up to realize that one of us, Kevin, had left the car keys back at the tent when we first parked. Not a huge deal, just annoying since we were planning to hike a bit further down the trails that day, and some of the stuff we needed was still in the cars. Kevin decided he'd go get them while the rest of us took our time making breakfast. We figured we'd hike out together after he came back. He'd only be gone about an hour. Kevin headed out, and the rest of us stayed behind, messing around with the fire and getting ready for the day. Maybe 30 minutes after he left, someone pointed out that we could no longer hear his footsteps on the trail. Not that big of a deal. We figured he'd just gotten out of earshot. We joked about him wandering off into the woods and getting lost, but no one was really worried. Another hour passed, though, and Kevin still wasn't back. That's when we started to think something was up. It should have only taken him about 40 minutes round trip max. We waited another half hour, but when he didn't show, we started getting concerned. I suggested we split up and go look for him. 2 of us head back toward the car while the others stay at camp in case he came back. I went with my buddy Chris to backtrack Kevin's route. As we walked, we kept shouting his name every few minutes, figuring he'd hear us and call back if he was nearby. But we got all the way to the car, and there was no sign of him. The keys were still where he said he left them, sitting on the seat of the car. But Kevin wasn't anywhere around. We figured maybe he'd gotten turned around and missed the trail back to the campsite. So we headed back to the clearing, hoping he'd be there by the time we returned. I was starting to feel anxious. It wasn't like Kevin to wander off without telling anyone. And even if he had, he'd only been walking along the trail we'd all used earlier. When we got back to the camp, though, he still wasn't there. At this point, it was starting to get late in the afternoon. We talked about what to do next, whether to stay put or go looking for him. We agreed to split up and search the area in pairs, staying close to the trail so we wouldn't get lost ourselves. It was a good plan, but as the hours passed and we still couldn't find any sign of Kevin, panic started to set in. We hadn't seen anyone else the entire time we'd been out there, and the forest was so thick that we could barely see through the trees beyond a few feet in some places. Around sunset, we regrouped at camp. Still no Kevin. We figured maybe he'd come back while we were out searching, but the camp was exactly how we left it. Nothing was touched. At that point, we knew something was seriously wrong. It was getting dark fast, and none of us felt comfortable splitting up again in the dark. That night was different from the first. No one was laughing or joking anymore. We all stayed close to the fire, going over the situation again and again, trying to figure out what could have happened. It didn't make sense. Kevin wasn't the kind of guy to wander off, and even if he had, he wouldn't have gone far. By now, he should have found his way back. We talked about hiking out to get help, but it was too late for that. The trail was too long to navigate in the dark, and we didn't want to risk someone else getting lost. So we agreed to wait until morning. Maybe Kevin had found a safe place to hole up for the night, and would show up first thing. The atmosphere around camp had completely changed. Every little sound in the woods had us on edge. We kept hearing what we thought were footsteps out in the trees, but every time we shone our flashlights in the direction of the noise, there was nothing there. Just the dark, dense forest, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. None of us slept that night. At first light, we packed up camp and hiked back to the cars. Our plan was to drive to the nearest ranger station and report Kevin missing. But as soon as we reached the clearing where we'd parked, we noticed something strange. One of the cars, Chris's car, had been moved. It was only a few feet from where we'd left it, but the angle was different, like someone had tried to back it out but gave up halfway through. There were also scratches on the driver's side door, deep enough to peel away some of the paint. The scratches looked like they had been made with some kind of tool, maybe a crowbar or something similar. None of us could explain it. The doors were locked, and there was no sign of forced entry, but the car had clearly been tampered with. We checked both cars, and everything else seemed untouched. Nothing was stolen, and the keys were still in my bag, just like we'd left them. That's when things really started to feel wrong. We had no idea who had been near the cars or what they had been trying to do. We double-checked the area, looking for tracks or any sign that someone had been there, but we didn't find anything. We didn't waste any more time. We piled into the cars and drove straight to the nearest ranger station. It took a while to explain the situation to the rangers, but they took it seriously and immediately organized a search team to go look for Kevin. They asked us to stay put while they sent a couple of guys back to the campsite and the surrounding area. The rest of the day was a blur. We spent hours waiting at the station, going over the details with the rangers again and again. They kept asking if Kevin had any reason to disappear on his own, but we told them the truth. There was no way he'd just take off like that, not without telling anyone. By the time the search team came back, it was almost dark again. They didn't find anything. No sign of Kevin, no tracks, no indication of where he might have gone. They assured us they would keep searching the next day and that they'd bring in more people to cover more ground. That night we drove into Athens and got a hotel. None of us wanted to stay in the forest. Not after what had happened. The whole situation felt unreal. One minute we were having a normal camping trip, and the next, Kevin was just gone like he'd vanished into thin air. The search for Kevin went on for several days. We stayed in Athens the whole time, waiting for updates from the rangers, but there wasn't much we could do. They searched the forest with dogs, helicopters, and more people than I could count. But they never found him. It was like he'd disappeared without a trace. Eventually, we had to go home. None of us wanted to, but the search was officially called off after a week. The rangers told us they'd keep looking, but there wasn't much hope. Kevin's family was devastated, and we all felt helpless. We'd come out to the woods for a fun weekend, and now one of our closest friends was missing. I still think about what happened a lot. None of it makes sense. How could Kevin just disappear like that? And who moved Chris's car? It feels like there's a piece of the puzzle that we're missing, something that would explain everything, but we'll probably never know. To this day, Kevin has never been found. There's been no sign of him, no evidence of foul play, nothing. Just an open case that will probably never be solved. I've gone camping since then, but it's never felt the same. Every time I go into the woods, I think about that trip. About Kevin walking off into the trees and never coming back. I try not to let it get to me, but sometimes when I'm out there alone, I can't help but feel like something's watching. Something just out of sight. Waiting. Last summer, my family and I went camping in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. It wasn't our first time camping as a family, but it was our first time at this particular location. We had heard good things about the area, and it seemed like the perfect spot to spend a weekend outdoors. The Pine Barrens are pretty well known, and we'd seen photos of beautiful, dense woods, perfect for hiking and disconnecting from everything. My wife, our 2 kids, ages 8 and 10, and I were excited for the trip. It was only about a 2-hour drive from our home in Philadelphia, and we had everything packed and ready by Friday afternoon. We arrived at the park in the early evening, just in time to set up camp before it got too dark. The campsite was far enough into the woods that we couldn't see anyone else around, which was perfect. There were no other tents or cars in sight, and that sense of isolation felt like a refreshing escape. We found a good spot near a small clearing and set up the tent, lit a fire, and started cooking dinner. The first night was normal. We roasted hot dogs, made s'mores, and told stories around the fire. The kids eventually got tired, so we tucked them into their sleeping bags inside the tent. My wife and I stayed up a little longer by the fire before heading to bed ourselves. I'm not a light sleeper, but I did wake up a couple of times that night. Nothing too weird, just the typical sounds you hear in the woods. Crickets, wind rustling the trees, maybe a branch snapping somewhere off in the distance. At the time, it didn't seem like anything to worry about, so I fell back asleep pretty quickly each time. The next day was great. We spent the morning hiking along one of the trails and the afternoon swimming in a nearby lake. By the time we got back to our campsite in the early evening, we were all tired, but feeling good. We made dinner again and settled in for another night of camping. That's when things started to feel off. After dinner, I noticed something weird. A small pile of rocks had been arranged near our campsite. It wasn't there when we left for our hike earlier in the day, and it definitely didn't look natural. It looked deliberate. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe the kids had done it while we were setting up camp the night before, or maybe someone else had been through the area. I didn't mention it to my wife or the kids because it didn't seem important. It was just a little odd. Later that evening, after we had gone to bed, I woke up again. This time to the sound of twigs snapping nearby. It wasn't a single snap either. It sounded like someone or something was walking through the woods just beyond our campsite. I lay there listening, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe it was an animal, but the footsteps sounded too deliberate for that. I didn't hear any grunting or rustling, just the sound of something walking and occasionally stepping on branches. I sat up and unzipped the tent quietly to look outside. I couldn't see anything. The fire had died down and the woods beyond were completely dark. The sound of the footsteps stopped as soon as I looked out, which was unnerving. After a few minutes of nothing, I zipped the tent back up and tried to go back to sleep. I didn't want to freak out my family, and I figured if it was something dangerous, we'd know by now. The next morning, we all got up, and I started to make breakfast. That's when I noticed something else strange. Our stack of firewood had been rearranged. We had piled it up pretty neatly the night before, but now it was scattered in a way that didn't look like an animal had messed with it. It looked almost like someone had moved the pieces intentionally. But for no reason that made sense. I asked my wife if she had moved the wood, and she said no. The kids hadn't touched it either. That's when I started to feel a little uneasy. The rock pile from yesterday, the footsteps during the night, now the firewood. It was starting to add up to something weird, but I still didn't want to overthink it. We were in the middle of the woods, after all. Maybe there was some logical explanation. We spent most of that day close to the campsite, just relaxing and exploring the immediate area. There was a creek nearby, so we let the kids splash around in the water for a bit while we kept an eye on them. Everything felt normal again during the day, but I couldn't quite shake the weirdness from the night before. As the sun started to set, I gathered some more firewood, and we got ready for our third night of camping. My wife and I decided not to tell the kids about the strange things we had noticed so far. They were having a great time, and we didn't want to scare them. That night, things escalated. We had all gone to bed by around 10 p.m., and I was struggling to fall asleep. I kept hearing little noises outside, but nothing major. Then at some point after midnight, I woke up to the sound of leaves crunching. This time it was much closer, right outside our tent. My heart started racing, and I lay perfectly still, listening. The sound of footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, circling around the tent. It wasn't an animal. It was too quiet, too calculated. I didn't know what to do. If I unzipped the tent again, I had no idea what or who I might see out there. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I stayed awake for a while longer, listening, but nothing happened. I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning was when we realized just how bad things had gotten. When we stepped out of the tent, we saw that the fabric had been slashed in several places. Long, jagged cuts, as if someone had taken a knife to it while we were sleeping. Nothing was missing from the tent. Our bags, our gear, everything was still there, untouched. But someone had been close enough to slash through the material while we were lying inside. That was the breaking point. I told my wife we needed to leave, and she didn't argue. We packed up everything as quickly as we could, trying to keep calm for the kids' sake. They didn't notice the slashes in the tent, which was a small relief. I didn't want them to be terrified for the rest of the trip home. We hiked back to the car in silence. Every now and then I would glance behind us, half expecting to see someone following. But the woods were empty as far as I could tell. We reached the car, loaded everything up, and got out of there as fast as we could. We didn't talk much on the drive home. The kids fell asleep in the back seat, and my wife and I just stared out the windows, trying to process what had happened. I kept running it through my head, trying to figure out if there was some logical explanation. Maybe a prank, maybe some kind of weird local custom we didn't know about. But I couldn't come up with anything that made sense. Someone had been watching us, following us, and messing with us while we slept, and we had no idea who they were or why they were doing it. When we got home, I didn't report it to the police. There didn't seem to be any point. What could I even tell them? That someone slashed our tent in the middle of the night but didn't take anything? That we heard footsteps in the woods? It wasn't exactly a crime, at least not one they could do anything about. We haven't been camping since. The kids ask about it every now and then, wondering when we'll go back. But my wife and I always find an excuse. We stick to day trips now. Hikes, picnics, that kind of thing. But the idea of spending another night in the woods completely vulnerable with nothing but a thin layer of nylon between us and whoever or whatever might be out there. I can't do it. Looking back, I wish I had trusted my instincts earlier. Those little things, like the rock piles and the firewood, were probably warnings. Someone was messing with us, testing how far they could push before we noticed, and we didn't take it seriously until it was too late. I haven't really talked much about this, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately. A couple of years ago, my son and I went on a camping trip in the middle of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway, just the two of us. I'd camped there a few times before, but this time we wanted to go deeper into the forest, away from the main trails, to really experience the wilderness. We left early on a Friday morning, packed up with enough supplies to last us for a couple of days. The drive up there was uneventful. We stopped in a small town called Eagle River to get gas and some snacks, and then kept going until we reached the entrance to the national forest. The further we drove, the more isolated it felt. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how nice it was going to be to get away from everything. We parked at one of the more remote trailheads. The plan was to hike in a few miles, find a good spot to set up camp, and then just spend the weekend hiking and fishing. It was early summer and the weather was perfect. We followed a well-marked trail for the first couple of miles, passing a few other hikers along the way. But after a while, we came across this narrow, unmarked path that branched off from the main trail. It was overgrown and didn't look like it had been used much, but that's what intrigued us. My son, who was about 14 at the time, was all for exploring it. He's the adventurous type, and I figured why not? We had time, and it wasn't like we were on a schedule. We took the path, winding deeper and deeper into the forest. After about half an hour, we came across this small clearing. It wasn't on any of the maps I had, but it looked like someone had camped there before. There were remnants of an old fire pit, some charred logs, and a few scattered pieces of trash. It was clear that no one had been there in a while, though. The place had this weird, forgotten vibe. Overgrown with weeds and surrounded by dense trees, it was the kind of spot that you'd only find if you were really looking for it. I wasn't too concerned at first. We set up our tent near the edge of the clearing, close to the trees, and gathered some firewood from around the area. As we were setting up camp, though, I noticed something that made me a bit uneasy. There were old, discarded items scattered around the clearing, things like a rusty camping stove, some empty cans, and a torn-up backpack. It wasn't just normal camping trash. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, abandoning their gear, but the stuff had been there long enough to start rusting and decaying, so whoever left it had been gone for a while. I pointed it out to my son, but he shrugged it off, saying it was probably just some careless campers. Maybe they got lost and decided to leave their gear behind. I didn't have a better explanation, so I went along with it. We spent the rest of the afternoon fishing at a nearby creek. And when we came back to camp, we cooked up what we caught and settled in for the evening. That's when things started to get weird. As the sun went down, the forest around us got darker and quieter than I expected. I've spent a lot of time camping, and I'm used to the sounds of the woods at night, crickets, owls, the occasional rustling in the bushes. But here it was different. It was too quiet. The usual nighttime sounds were distant, like they were far away from our campsite. I remember sitting by the fire, poking at the flames, and feeling this weird tension in the air. I chalked it up to being in a more isolated area than I was used to, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy. Around 10 or 11 that night, as we were sitting by the fire, we started hearing noises coming from the trees around us. At first, it was subtle, just the occasional rustling of leaves or a twig snapping. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer moving around in the woods. But then the sounds got louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just random rustling anymore. It sounded like someone or something was moving through the brush, circling the clearing. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the trees. But I didn't see anything. The beam of light only reached so far before it got swallowed by the darkness. My son was getting nervous, asking me what I thought it was, but I didn't have an answer. I told him it was probably just a deer. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Deer don't move like that. They're skittish. Whatever this was, it was moving slowly, deliberately. The noises continued for another hour or so, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. Eventually, they stopped, and the forest went back to being eerily quiet. We put out the fire and crawled into the tent. But I didn't sleep much that night. I kept listening, waiting to hear the sounds again, but it stayed quiet. I figured whatever it was had moved on, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. The next morning, we packed up our stuff and decided to do some more exploring. I still couldn't shake the weird feeling from the night before, but I didn't want to ruin the trip for my son, so I kept it to myself. We spent most of the day hiking around the area, checking out the streams and enjoying the scenery. By the time we got back to the clearing, it was late afternoon. That's when we found the notebook. It was buried under some leaves and dirt near the fire pit, like someone had tried to hide it but didn't do a very good job. My son was the one who spotted it, and he pulled it out of the dirt, laughing about how someone had probably dropped it. At first, I thought it was just an old journal or something, maybe left behind by one of the previous campers. But when I opened it, I realized it was something else entirely. The pages were filled with writing, scribbles, notes, drawings. It was all jumbled, like whoever had written it wasn't in their right mind. There were pages full of random words, weird symbols, and what looked like ramblings about the forest watching and being followed. At first I thought it was just nonsense, but as I flipped through the pages, the writing became more disturbing. There were detailed descriptions of violent fantasies, things that made my stomach turn. Stuff about trapping people in the woods, watching them from the trees, and waiting for the right moment. I remember my son asking me what it said, and I quickly closed the notebook, telling him it was just some junk and not to worry about it. But inside I was freaked out. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it some twisted joke, or had someone actually been living out here? thinking about doing the things they'd written in that notebook. Either way, I wasn't comfortable staying in that spot any longer. I told my son we were packing up and heading back to the car. He protested at first, saying we hadn't spent enough time out there, but I wasn't about to risk it. I didn't tell him about the contents of the notebook, but I'm pretty sure he could tell something was wrong. As we packed up our gear, I kept looking around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. It felt like we were being watched, but every time I looked, there was nothing. Just the dense, silent forest. We left the clearing and started hiking back toward the main trail. The whole time I had this nagging feeling that someone was following us just out of sight. I kept turning around expecting to see someone or something there, but the path behind us was always empty. It took us about an hour to get back to the main trail, and I've never been so relieved to see other hikers in my life. There were a couple of groups heading back to the parking lot, and just being around other people made me feel a little safer. We didn't stop to chat with anyone, though. I just wanted to get back to the car and leave. When we finally made it to the parking lot, I tossed our gear in the trunk and we drove out of there as fast as we could. The whole drive back home, I couldn't stop thinking about that notebook, about the weird noises in the woods and the feeling that we had narrowly avoided something bad. I never reported what we found. I don't know if I should have or if it would have made any difference. It's been a couple of years now, and I still think about that trip from time to time, especially when I'm out hiking or camping. I've been back to Chequamegon Nicolet National Forest since then, but I've never gone back to that spot. I don't know what happened there or who left that notebook, and honestly, I don't want to know.